Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. Dr. Jonathan Marsh had always been a man of precision. As one of the leading physicists at the prestigious Temporal Research Institute, he had dedicated his life to unlocking the mysteries of time. The concept of time travel had fascinated him ever since he was a child, and now, in his mid-30s, he was on the brink of a breakthrough. The Institute had been abuzz with excitement as they prepared to test the latest iteration of the time travel device, a sleek machine that hummed with the energy of 1,000 untold possibilities. Jonathan stood in the center of the laboratory, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the controls. He had rehearsed this moment countless times in his mind, but the reality of it was far more nerve-wracking than he had anticipated. The plan was simple. A short jump back in time, no more than a few hours, just to test the machine's stability and accuracy. But as he keyed in the final coordinates, a strange feeling crept over him, a sense of foreboding that he couldn't quite shake. He brushed the thought aside, attributing it to pre-experiment jitters. After all, he was about to make history. With a deep breath, Jonathan activated the device. The air around him crackled with energy, and the laboratory seemed to blur and distort. The world tilted, and for a moment, Jonathan felt as if he were being pulled through a tunnel of light. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The machine powered down, the humming subsiding into silence. Jonathan blinked, trying to clear the spots from his vision. Something was wrong. He was no longer in the laboratory. The sleek, modern surroundings of his research institute had vanished, replaced by the familiar warmth of a small, cozy living room, his living room. Or rather, his parents' living room. Panic surged through Jonathan as he took in his surroundings. The floral-patterned wallpaper, the old television set, the worn but comfortable furniture, it was all exactly as he remembered it from his childhood. But that was impossible. He couldn't have traveled back that far. Could he? His thoughts were abruptly interrupted by a sound that sent a chill down his spine. It was the sound of a baby crying. And it was coming from very close by. Jonathan's heart raced as he turned toward the source of the noise. There, lying in a crib that had been placed in the center of the room, was a baby. A baby who looked exactly like him. It took a moment for the full horror of the situation to sink in. Somehow, in a freak accident, Jonathan had been transported back in time to his own infancy. And worse, he was now inhabiting his infant self. He tried to scream, to shout, to call for help, but all that came out was a high-pitched wail. He was trapped, completely and utterly trapped in the body of a baby, with no way to communicate, no way to fix the situation, and no way to return to the future. Jonathan's mind raced as he struggled to come to terms with his predicament. He had to think, had to find a way to fix this. But how? He couldn't even hold a pencil, let alone operate a time machine. And then there was the timeline to consider. Any interference could have catastrophic consequences. He had to be careful, had to avoid doing anything that might alter the course of history, but how could he possibly do that when he was stuck in this helpless, infantile body? Days turned into weeks as Jonathan adjusted to his new reality. The initial shock and panic slowly gave way to a grim acceptance. He was a baby again, and there was nothing he could do about it. His days were filled with the indignities of infancy, diaper changes, feeding sessions, and endless cooing from his parents, who had no idea that their precious baby boy was actually a 30-something physicist from the future. It was all Jonathan could do to keep from going mad. His only solace was his internal monologue, the one part of his adult self that remained intact. He would spend hours silently narrating his thoughts, commenting on the absurdity of his situation, and mentally mocking the various indignities he was forced to endure. But as time went on, Jonathan began to realize that his situation was not without its perks. For one thing, he had a unique opportunity to observe his family from a perspective he had never before considered. He saw his parents not as authority figures, but as real, flawed human beings. He saw their struggles, their worries, their hopes and dreams, all in a way that he had never fully appreciated before. And then there was his older brother, Tommy. As a child, Jonathan had always seen Tommy as a bit of a bully, a troublemaker who delighted in tormenting his younger sibling. But now, seeing Tommy through the eyes of an infant, Jonathan began to understand the complexity of their relationship. Tommy was jealous, that much was clear. Jealous of the attention that the new baby was getting, jealous of the way their parents doted on Jonathan, and jealous of the fact that his own antics were no longer the center of the family's attention. Jonathan could see it in the way Tommy would sulk in the corner, in the way he would act out for attention, and in the way he would sometimes lash out at Jonathan, even though he was just a baby. But there was something else, too. A hint of something deeper, something more profound. Jonathan could see that Tommy loved him, in his own way. It was there in the way Tommy would sneak into the nursery at night, just to watch Jonathan sleep. It was there in the way he would bring Jonathan his favorite toys, even though he never admitted it out loud. And it was there in the way Tommy would fiercely protect Jonathan from the neighborhood kids, even though he would never let Jonathan know that it was a side of Tommy that Jonathan had never seen before, a side that made him feel a pang of guilt for the way he had always dismissed his brother as a mere troublemaker. But now, stuck in this infantile body, Jonathan began to understand the depth of Tommy's emotions, the complexity of his character, and the strength of their bond. As the weeks turned into months, Jonathan's life settled into a strange routine. He would wake up each morning, endure the rituals of babyhood, and spend the rest of the day observing his family, learning about them in ways he had never imagined possible. But there were challenges, too. Big challenges. And they came in the form of the small, seemingly insignificant events that made up the fabric of everyday life. One of the biggest challenges was the constant temptation to intervene, to use his knowledge of the future to help his family in some way. There were so many things he could do, so many ways he could make their lives better. But he knew that doing so could have disastrous consequences for the timeline. He had to resist the urge, had to let events unfold as they were meant to. It was easier said than done. One day, for example, Jonathan overheard his parents discussing a financial decision that he knew would lead to trouble in the future. His father was considering investing in a business venture that would eventually go bankrupt, causing the family a great deal of financial hardship. Jonathan knew that he could stop it, that he could somehow communicate the danger to his parents and save them from the pain that was to come. But he also knew that doing so could alter the course of history in ways he couldn't predict. He had to let it happen, had to trust that everything would work out in the end. Another challenge came in the form of his brother, Tommy. As Jonathan had suspected, Tommy's jealousy eventually boiled over into resentment, and he began to act out in increasingly destructive ways. He would take Jonathan's toys, hide them, and then laugh as Jonathan cried. He would sneak into the nursery at night and pull pranks, like placing a frog in Jonathan's crib or smearing peanut butter on the walls. Jonathan had to find ways to deal with Tommy's antics without revealing his true nature. He couldn't retaliate directly, so he had to get creative. For example, when Tommy hid Jonathan's favorite toy, a stuffed bear, Jonathan managed to accidentally roll it back into his crib during a particularly boisterous playtime, all while maintaining the appearance of an innocent baby. Tommy was none the wiser, and Jonathan took a small, silent satisfaction in his victory, but there were moments when Jonathan's adult knowledge slipped through, leading to unintended consequences. One day, while playing in the living room, Jonathan heard his mother mention that she was planning to bake cookies. Without thinking, he babbled a string of words that sounded suspiciously like the recipe for her famous chocolate chip cookies. His mother, startled, stared at him in disbelief. "Did you just say something?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of amusement and confusion. Jonathan quickly reverted to baby noises, but the damage was done. His mother began to tell everyone about her genius baby, and soon, word spread through the neighborhood that little Jonathan was a child prodigy. It became harder and harder for Jonathan to maintain his cover as a normal baby, especially when his parents started to test his intelligence with flashcards and puzzles. As time went on, Jonathan began to notice small, seemingly insignificant changes in the timeline, changes that he suspected were the result of his own actions. For example, Tommy, who had always been a mediocre student, suddenly started showing an interest in math and science, inspired by his genius baby brother. This small change led to a series of events that culminated in Tommy becoming the top student in his class, a development that Jonathan had never seen in his original timeline. Jonathan couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. Had he altered the course of his brother's life? Had he set Tommy on a path that would lead to an entirely different future? He couldn't be sure, but the possibility weighed heavily on his mind. As the months passed, Jonathan's life as a baby became increasingly complex. He was constantly on guard, constantly trying to avoid doing anything that might further disrupt the timeline. But despite his best efforts, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was slowly but surely altering the course of history in ways he couldn't fully understand. The tipping point came one evening when Jonathan overheard a conversation between his parents. His mother was expressing concern about a persistent cough that she had been dealing with for weeks. Jonathan knew what that cough meant. He knew that in his original timeline, it would eventually develop into a serious illness that would leave his mother bedridden for months. He also knew that there was a way to prevent it, a simple change in diet and medication that could stop the illness before it began. The temptation was almost overwhelming. Jonathan loved his mother dearly, and the thought of her suffering was unbearable. But he also knew that intervening could have catastrophic consequences. What if saving his mother altered the timeline in ways he couldn't predict? What if it led to even greater suffering in the future? Jonathan wrestled with the decision for days, torn between his love for his family and his responsibility to the timeline. In the end, he decided to trust in the natural course of events. He chose not to intervene, not to alter the timeline, no matter how much it pained him. It was the hardest decision he had ever made. As the months turned into a year, Jonathan's life as a baby reached its inevitable conclusion. He knew that the time was approaching when he would be returned to the future, when the timeline would right itself, and he would be back in his adult body. But as the day drew nearer, he found himself filled with a strange sense of melancholy. Despite all the challenges, despite all the hardships, he had come to cherish his time with his family. He had gained a new understanding of them, a new appreciation for the people they were and the lives they led. And then, one evening, as Jonathan lay in his crib, staring up at the mobile that hung above him, he felt a familiar sensation, a tingling, a sense of being pulled through a tunnel of light. The world around him blurred and distorted, and for a moment, he felt as if he were floating through space and time. When he opened his eyes again, he was back in the laboratory. The sleek, modern surroundings of the Temporal Research Institute greeted him, and the familiar hum of the time machine filled the air. No time had passed since the experiment began. Jonathan sat up, his heart pounding in his chest. He was back. He was himself again, an adult, a physicist, a man of precision and science. But something had changed. The experience had left him with a deeper understanding of the importance of letting life unfold naturally. He had learned that some things were beyond his control, that time had a way of righting itself, and that his role was not to interfere, but to observe, to learn, and to appreciate the preciousness of every moment. As Jonathan resumed his work at the Institute, he found himself looking at the world with new eyes. He was more patient, more understanding, more willing to let things unfold in their own time. He had learned that sometimes, the best way to protect the timeline was to simply let go, to trust in the natural course of events, and to have faith that everything would work out in the end. But the experience had left one small, unexpected change in the timeline. As Jonathan settled back into his life, he discovered that his brother, Tommy, had grown up to become a famous candy mogul. It was a small, seemingly insignificant change, but it was enough to remind Jonathan of the delicate balance of time, and the impact that even the smallest actions could have on the course of history. And so, with a quiet smile, Jonathan resumed his work, knowing that he had gained something far more valuable than any scientific discovery. He had gained a new perspective on life, on time, and on the importance of letting go.